Okay, today is Wednesday the 15th, 2021. We're at Peggy Sterling Miller's house and we're chatting and she's telling stories. So it's all yours, Peggy Joe.
Okay.
I'm going to focus in a little bit, set this down, and I think that's about good.
Okay. When I was a little bitty kid, I'm 1 year old when my little sister Fanny is born. She's sick, very sick. She's the most beautiful little girl. She has these dimples in her face under her eyes. So she could even cry with dimples showing. She was so pretty. But they were always filled with tears because she was so allergic to milk, and so she cried for her first year of life, and Mom held her that whole year, trying to take care of her. I was just fine. I was 1 year old, and I was in a diaper, and I had no mother. So Aunt Augusta took me, really, to live with her. So she had this amazing ability to do perfection. She was the original disciplined. She she could peel a tomato and you didn't see a mark. Her potatoes were peeled so perfectly. There was no knife mark. I couldn't get over it. So, she made her own bread. She had a kerosene stove with 4 fires, but on those fires, she also had this little bitty portable black oven. You could take the handle by the top and take it off. It was a campfire oven. She made 6 loaves of bread in that little campfire stove every week. Her flour was kept in a tall bin in her kitchen with another bin half its size full of sugar. Her kitchen was so small she had no running water. They had no toilet in the house. You had to go outside. The water came from the cistern, and so you had water, but you had to boil every bit of it in this great big tea kettle on the kerosene stove in this itty bitty kitchen, which was never a mess. It was immaculate. The refrigerator was an ice box. She was so excited to get a refrigerator and get electricity. It was amazing because then she could buy things like celery, and she could go ahead and have all her butters made. And the way she bought the butter loaves from the creamery in Edinburgh, Golden Jersey Creamery, and she bought the boxes, she bought the papers, and she had this 1 pound mold that would fit the boxes. So the mold was perfectly done. She'd take that. It had to be cold so she could move it, push up the bottom, and here is this whole pound of butter. She would wrap it in this perfect paper, put it in this perfect butter box. Now she had a real refrigerator for them. So, she had this wonderful flower garden outside in the spring. She would flood irrigate, and all her seeds from last year would come up. There was no weed, no grass in her flowers. Thousands of flowers, so gorgeous, multiple colors. Phlox, larkspur, California poppies, always there every year. She would make these little bouquets, and she would go ahead and take them to the neighbors with a pound of butter. What a nice thing to do for her neighbors. Flowers were picked for the church, especially her thousands of Easter lilies. So, she was just so much fun for me to live with. She taught me a lot about gardening. The chicken yard, her yard was fenced in from the chickens. The chickens were fenced out. So we had a big chicken yard. It had a huge mulberry tree with all these purple mulberries. The chickens ate purple mulberries. There was purple dew everywhere when there were these wonderful berries. She collected the biggest ones from the tree and made pies, and it's still Brother Scott's favorite pie ever. These big bubbling fruit, so dark purple. So she was just a spectacular person. She took care of these chickens. She would milk the cows in the morning, and she would fill these crocks along the back of her porch. So they're all filled with milk, left there all night to curdle. So when you got up in the morning, they were these glassy topped milk, already curdled. They always had recipes that said sweet milk, sour milk, buttermilk, but they always used the term sweet milk. With this was curdled milk. And she had this wonderful mash that she would buy, fill these feeders with mash, and then she would mix this curds into it and stir it in. And the chickens loved that stuff. They would gobble it up. So in the feeding area, she had this wonderful mash with curds, I called it. She had this oyster stuff all in little pieces so their shells would be really strong. They were always strong. Big, huge eggs. She would go out into the roadside, and in the ditches she would go ahead and cut weeds. She would come back with these long strands of pigweed, whatever was just the right weed. She would wrap the end of it with string and tie it along with the other food that she prepared for the chickens. They'd start pecking on it. By the end of the day, it was all dragged down. It was scratched. It was pecked. And it turned into the floor. You never saw it again. It disappeared. So it was really fun to watch the chickens to eat. So then she would get a whole 100 new baby chicks early the next year. And she would have heaters and protective wires around them so that we had all these black snakes that liked to eat those. They were always in the laying house to go ahead and eat the eggs. So I'd go out there, and I'm little, and I have to stand on tiptoe because we have 2 layers of laying boxes on each side of the laying house. So we must have had like a dozen places for them to make their nest and lay eggs. But there was always those stupid black snakes. And so I'd slap those black snakes and they'd slither away. Fanny would touch them and run screaming. I mean, they terrified her. She stepped on them one night going to Grandma's house barefoot, and she had shudders ever again from a black snake. So Augusta had everything with wires set up so the black snakes couldn't get the baby chicks. And so, she was the mother of all her animals. They were fed to perfection. So when you wanted to get the hens into the hen house at night, where she had these big roosting bars, there were 4 of them, if I remember right. So 3 sides were solid tin roof, slanted roof, so the rain would go out the back. In the front, there was wire, so you could see into the hen house. but at the bottom they were like triple wire to keep out the coyotes, the foxes, and the snakes. And so her chickens were well protected. To get them to come at night, because they're roaming all over, down to where the corral was, where you milk the cows, where the barn was that had all the food. Lots of cats, keep out the mice and rats. They were always hanging around. When Bruce milked a cow, he didn't do it like everybody else because the bucket is there. The milk didn't go in the bucket. He was killing red ants and feeding these crazy cats that we had. And Augusta was so mad at Bruce all the time, but he didn't follow any rule. And Aunt Augusta was full of rules. So I'm watching my brother's behavior, and Aunt Augusta wasn't going to let me be like Bruce. So it was great fun. You know, she made my pajamas. Oh, she took grains and fed them their grain to draw the chickens in. She'd call them, and she'd have this big bucket of grain, and she starts putting this grain out. All the hens and pullets came, and they followed this trail of grain to the hen house where she locked them up for the night. They would climb up in the bars and sleep. Great fun. I love the chickens. Every afternoon I gathered eggs and slapped away the snakes, and I didn't want them to have these beautiful eggs. The eggs were huge. They were all brown. She had a lot of brown chickens.
Did you ever learn to kill a chicken?
No, I never killed a chicken.
Okay.
But it was interesting watching the process because Grandma was still alive and her hands were so terribly deformed with arthritis, and she was always rubbing them very carefully, and she hurt all the time. She always had her hand to her face. This is when she was walking through the yard one day. She tripped on a hanger. She fell and broke her hip. They didn't have surgery for broken hips then. She was put in a wheelchair with a very painful broken hip and stayed there. It was horrible. So Aunt Augusta was very tender with her, and she included her in the jobs because Grandma had taught Aunt Augusta everything. All her discipline was from Grandma. So Aunt Augusta would cut off the chicken's head, let it flop around, get rid of the blood, and she would bring it in the house and put it in a bucket. She got the tea kettle with boiling water from the kitchen, and she would fill that poor chicken and all its feathers with boiling water. When it cooled down just a bit, Aunt Augusta gave the bucket to Grandma, pouring out the boiling water. So Grandma would remove the feathers. And Aunt Augusta, when she got that done, her poor hands, I can still see her hands plucking feathers out of that smelly bird because it kind of made a scent with that boiling water. Kind of offensive to me. So I admired Grandma doing that, but she got it done with those poor hands. Aunt Augusta came and took all those feathers away, and she very carefully picked out all the pin feathers, and then she cleaned the inside of the bird, removing all the interior, cleaning it up, ready to cook some of it, the liver. She didn't really cook the gizzard or the neck like Mom did, so those kind of were discarded. But her chicken was cooked in a big black skillet, very little oil. I think some of the time she had it soaking in buttermilk. I'm not really sure about that, but I think she did. She had lots of buttermilk. So she would shake it off and put it in this brown paper sack that was filled with flour, salt, and pepper. She would very carefully shake it, take the piece of chicken out, and put it into this large black skillet. After all the chicken was in there, it was so evenly cooked you couldn't believe it. It was like it was seared on the outside. But these pullets, the younger chicken that she was growing to eat, it was amazing how big the parts were. So they didn't cook through. So she put the lid on, and Dorothy Lee said she smothered her fried chicken. So we had this extraordinary chicken that just melted in your mouth. It fell off the bones. We couldn't wait to eat it. It was so good. But it was smothered fried chicken, which was Aunt Augusta's invention. It was just delicious. Scott would come over after we had moved to go plow the fields, take care of Aunt Augusta's fields. She didn't know when he was coming, so she always said, "Scott, come by for chicken." So he couldn't wait. But she didn't have a chicken ready to fry. So she had to go out, kill the chicken, pluck the chicken, clean the chicken, and get it washed and in the refrigerator to cool before she fixed it. And Scott never realized what she had to do to fix a chicken dinner for him until I told him. He was appalled that she would do all of that work to feed him a chicken dinner. His opinion of Aunt Augusta just skyrocketed. He couldn't believe it. So those were the things she did for us that were just incredible. But anyway, Fanny is born having real health issues. So Aunt Augusta takes me in her arms, never having a child before to raise, and raised me. She had my double bed outside in her porch, cold in the winters. The quilts that she made out of pure wool weighed me down. You couldn't turn over. But she brought bricks that were really, really, really hot. She wrapped them in newspaper and made my bed warm for me to crawl into. She made all my pajamas. When I was 7 years old, I started selecting my own fabric for her to make my clothes from. She bought flour in 100-pound bags. She kept them in these great buckets in the kitchen. And she did the same with sugar. So she had these 2 huge containers. When she would run out of flour, she needed to buy a 100-pound sack of flour. So she started taking me to the grocery store to select my next dress. So I started selecting my own material for pajamas and little dresses. She would make them during the day when I was in school. I came home. They had been made, they had been washed, they were all ironed. So next day I had a new dress to wear to school. Her rule was, you brushed your teeth. You kept clean. You never went to school dirty. You never had holes in your underpants. It was World War II. You didn't have elastic for your panties, so all of a sudden, to go to a Ferris apartment store, we bought our panties with buttons on them to hold them up. Sometimes they didn't work, so you had to really do a good job of putting them on. So, she gave me all these rules to live by. Clean hair. If it's too cold to wash your hair, then you've got to make sure that you scrub the part. She would scrub the part in my hair so hard sometimes I thought my head would split. But every morning she checked my scalp, brushed my hair, long braids, and she would rebraid my hair. One time they took a picture of me in school, and my hair was braided so tight I looked like a rabbit. It was just so tight because she didn't want you to have messy hair. Augusta's rules. So you left the house with Margie's hand-me-down shoes. I wore her hand-me-down clothes, but Aunt Dorothy took Margie to San Antonio to buy clothes for the next school year. So I had these really lovely clothes to wear. So I had things that were not made at home. They were the only clothes I had that were not handmade out of flour sacks. So I loved Aunt Dorothy because she did not wait. Margie outgrew them. They were mine. She got them to me before I grew out of them, which was really important because we were 2 years apart. So I loved Margie to death, and I got my first pair of new shoes when I was in the first grade. I had earned my own money and bought my own shoes. My first pair of new shoes was 5th grade. So I grew up being very, very grateful to Aunt Dorothy and Margie. Margie giggled all the time. She was at our house a lot. She and Dorothy were great friends. And Dorothy's job was to keep Margie laughing. So Margie would put her hands over her mouth, and this is the way lots of her pictures were. She's giggling so loud she had to shut up because Dorothy's telling these horrible, outrageous things to her to keep her laughing. It was just great fun. So Dorothy liked to have slumber parties, so she had these great slumber parties. We fixed piles of enchiladas. And so if the girls were coming, here came the boys. Dorothy had enchiladas for everybody. So Dad loved all of these girls at his house, and he would get up in the morning and make pancakes every time they came. So he flipped pancakes to all these girls, no boys by then, by breakfast. But these girls loved coming to see my dad. They would send him coffee cups with his name on them, and Renee Wallace especially loved my dad. She thought he was a marshal or something, a Texas Ranger riding his horse. He rented pasture land up Jackson's field, right? And Dad had cattle in the brush. So he'd want to go check on it, and he wore chaps. So he got on his tall pinto horse with chaps that almost hit the ground. And sometimes, there was so little food, he'd go up and burn cactus so that they'd have cactus to eat. But he had to go burn it to go ahead and get the spines off of it. So he would leave with his big gas burner in his hand and his long chaps and his summer hat on. And he was like this god in this saddle. He was so tall, 6'4", red hair to die for, and always with a hat on. So it was such a fine thing to see him ride on his pinto horse. We loved to see him in it. So I grew up with all these examples of people that were so fine. When I'm about 12, we moved to our new house from our little country house by Grandma Sterling. So the girls had a big room. It was 15 by 20 feet, our own big walk-in closet, and our own bathroom. So at the end of the living room was our bedroom door. At age 12, I get a knock on the door. It's Saturday. Dad calls out, "Saddle up." I'm the girl that is the cowgirl. So I get up and go meet the cowboys where they have the horses at the corral, quite a ways from the house. So I trek on over there. I never had boots, but I had jeans and tennis shoes and a straw hat because a little later in the day it really got hot. So I run over there because you weren't going to be late for Dad, so you were on time. He liked my time, my discipline. I was never late. I listened to him. I did what he said, and so we got along great. Saddle up, mount, go with the cowboys. There were generally two or three. Sometimes Dad, but not always. So our job that day is to wean calves from their mothers. The calves are as big as their mothers, so they're huge animals. They did not want to leave their mama's side. Their mama was still feeding them cow's milk. And of course, we wanted the cows to go ahead and dry up so that they could become new mothers. So we had to very carefully remove those cows, bawling all the way to their new pasture, leaving those big, huge calves in the pasture they were in.